The gift of beginnings. The night in Chennai was hot and restless. The kind of night when the air pressed down like a heavy blanket, and the silence was only broken by the occasional bark of a stray dog or the whir of a distant fan that refused to stop creaking. Sundar lay on his thin mattress, eyes open, staring at the cracks on the ceiling that seemed to tell stories of their own. His family's small house was crowded, filled with the smell of cooked rice and the soft breathing of his younger brother. Outside, the streetlight flickered as if it was fighting a battle to stay alive, glowing for a few seconds, dimming, then glowing again. It was under that weak streetlight that Sundar often sat, books spread out, trying to study even when the electricity inside their home failed. From the beginning, Sundar carried a hunger inside him, though it was not a hunger for food. Food was scarce sometimes, yes, but what stirred him more was the hunger for something he could not yet name. He wanted to know why the radio played voices from faraway lands. He wanted to understand why the phone in his neighbor's house could bring news from another city in seconds. He wanted to know why machines listened when humans pressed the right buttons. The questions filled his head like restless birds, and often he would lie awake imagining a world much bigger than the narrow streets of his neighborhood. His father, a quiet man who worked for the railways, would sometimes notice Sundar's faraway look. "Life is not easy, my boy," he would say in a tired voice. "But if you respect it, if you stay humble, it will teach you things no school can." Sundar would nod, not entirely understanding, but he carried those words like treasures. His mother, warm and patient, worked endlessly in the kitchen. She stretched every grain of rice, every rupee, into meals that filled not just stomachs but hearts. She had little schooling, but her wisdom was deep. When Sundar struggled with doubts, she would place her hand on his head and whisper, "Your mind is strong. Never forget kindness, never forget where you come from." One evening, as the sky turned orange and shadows grew longer, Sundar noticed something on the table near the window. It was the family's old radio, a bulky box with scratches and dust covering its surface. The radio had stopped working weeks ago and everyone assumed it was dead, but Sundar could not let it go. He stared at the knobs, at the wires sticking out, and felt an unexplainable pull. He remembered the nights when the radio had filled their home with songs, cricket commentaries, and breaking news. It was more than a machine to him. It was a doorway to the world. Slowly, almost as if he were afraid of breaking it further, Sundar picked up the radio. He placed it gently on the floor, examining the screws in the back panel. His hands trembled, but his eyes sparkled with determination. He found a small screwdriver and began to twist, his breath quickening with every turn. The back panel came loose, revealing a world of wires, circuits, and tiny parts that looked like a maze. Sundar had never seen anything like it. He leaned closer, his nose almost touching the dusty surface, his heart beating fast. At that moment, time seemed to stand still. The voices of his parents faded. The sounds of the street outside disappeared. It was just him and the mysterious machine. He touched one wire, then another, his fingers clumsy but curious. He had no training, no books to explain what he was seeing. Yet something deep inside told him that if he just kept trying, if he respected the silence of the moment and listened closely, the machine would reveal its secret, but it was not easy. He cut his finger on a sharp edge and a drop of blood stained the floor. He winced, but instead of stopping, he felt even more determined. His younger brother peeked into the room and laughed. "You will never fix it, Anna. You will only break it more." Sundar looked up, smiled softly, and said nothing. He had learned early that silence often carried more strength than arguments. Hours passed. The sun went down completely, and the flickering streetlight outside became his only companion. Sweat dripped down his forehead, mixing with the dust on his face. And then, as if by some miracle, the radio crackled. Just for a second, a burst of static filled the air. Sundar's heart leaped. He adjusted a knob, touched a loose wire, and suddenly a voice came alive. Faint, broken, but alive. His brother gasped. His mother rushed in, wiping her hands on her sari, and his father looked up from the newspaper, eyes wide. The radio was playing again, stumbling through static, but carrying music, carrying life. Sundar's mother pressed her hands together, whispering, "God bless this boy." His father smiled, the rare kind of smile that reached his eyes. Sundar felt something he had never felt before. Not just pride, but purpose. Yet as he sat there, listening to the crackling voice, Sundar did not know that this small act, this quiet evening, was the beginning of a journey that would carry him across oceans and into rooms filled with power, pressure, and choices that would test his soul. The night grew late, and Sundar stayed awake long after everyone else had gone to sleep. He stared at the radio, its faint glow lighting his face. He whispered to himself, "If I can bring this back to life, maybe I can bring anything to life." But in the silence of the night, just as his eyes began to close, he heard a sound. A sudden pop, a sharp crack, and then the radio went silent again. Sundar's eyes flew open. He touched the box, but it was dead. His heart sank, and fear crept in. Had he only imagined its brief return to life? Had he destroyed it forever? The last thing he saw before sleep finally claimed him was the broken radio, lying quietly in the corner, waiting like a locked door to a mystery that would demand everything from him before it opened again. The climb through fire. The morning sun in Chennai rose slowly, painting the sky with soft pink and golden streaks. Sundar woke up earlier than usual, his mind still haunted by the memory of the broken radio that had gone silent in the night. Yet even with the silence, he felt something different inside him, a seed planted deep in his heart. He understood, now that the world was full of mysteries, and if he kept asking questions, kept trying no matter how many times he failed, he could find answers. School was never easy for Sundar. He walked long distances in worn-out sandals, carrying a bag heavier than his small shoulders seemed capable of holding. His classmates sometimes mocked him for his simple clothes, for his quiet nature, for the way he often stared out the window as if he lived in another world. But Sundar had a calm strength that few could see. He listened more than he spoke. He observed details others ignored, and though he rarely raised his voice when he finally did, people listened not because it was loud, but because it was steady, almost unshakable. One afternoon, the school announced a science competition. The prize was small, a certificate, a few books, but for Sundar it was more than enough. It was a chance to prove something, not to others, but to himself. When he wrote his name on the sign-up sheet, some of his classmates laughed. "What will you bring, Sundar? A broken radio?" Their words stung, but Sundar only smiled. He remembered his father's advice. Silence often carried more weight than anger. He spent nights preparing. Their home was small, and there was no proper desk, so he worked on the floor by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. His mother often stayed awake with him, whispering stories to keep him company, boiling milk so he would not tire. His father, though strict and often tired from work, brought him old scraps of metal, screws and wires from the railway workshop. They had little, but they gave him everything they could. The day of the competition arrived, and the classroom buzzed with excitement. Students displayed colorful posters, neatly built models of rockets and bridges. Sundar stood quietly with his project, a simple model of an electrical circuit, built from old wires and parts salvaged from discarded machines. His hands trembled as he connected the wires, praying silently that it would work. The judges walked from table to table, nodding politely, asking questions. When they reached Sundar, they frowned at the rough edges of his project. One of them asked, "Did you build this yourself?" Sundar nodded, his voice steady. "Yes, sir. I used whatever I could find." They looked unimpressed, and for a moment Sundar felt a wave of shame rise in his chest. He thought of his classmates' laughter, their whispers. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was foolish to think he could compete. But then, with a deep breath, he switched on the small bulb attached to his circuit. To his relief, it flickered, then glowed brightly. The judges raised their eyebrows. The light was small, but in that moment it seemed to shine brighter than anything else in the room. Sundar explained how he had used the limited materials, how he had learned by trial and error. His words were simple, but his passion was clear. When the results were announced, Sundar did not win first place. He did not even win second. He was given a special mention for innovation with limited resources. Some of his classmates cheered, others shrugged. But Sundar's heart was calm. For the first time, he understood that victory was not always about being the best. Sometimes, it was about being recognized for trying when no one thought you could. That evening, his father placed the certificate on the wall. "This," he said, pointing at the piece of paper, "is proof that effort matters more than results. Remember this, my son." His mother wiped her eyes, though she said nothing. Sundar felt a fire grow inside him, not a fire of pride, but of determination. He would keep climbing no matter how hard the path. Years passed and Sundar's world grew larger. He moved through school with quiet resilience, excelling in mathematics and science, surprising even his teachers with the way he solved problems others could not. Yet, beneath the achievements, he carried the same humility. He never forgot the nights studying under a flickering streetlight, the long walks to school, the laughter of classmates who once doubted him. Instead of anger, he felt gratitude. Every obstacle had shaped him. Every failure had pushed him further. But life had more. Tests waiting. One evening, as Sundar sat at the table helping his brother with homework, his father came home with a small envelope in his hand. His face was unreadable. He placed the envelope on the table and said, "This is for you." Sundar opened it, slowly, his hands shaking. Inside was a telegram, its paper yellow and thin, the letters unevenly stamped. The message was short, but the words made his breath catch in his throat. It was an invitation, a possibility that could take him far, beyond the narrow streets of Chennai, far beyond the world he had always known. His eyes widened, his heart raced, and for the first time he felt the weight of destiny pressing down on him. His mother leaned closer, asking softly, "What does it say?" Sundar looked up, his voice trembling, but before he could speak, the light in the house went out. Darkness filled the room. The telegram slipped from his hands and fell to the floor. In the silence, the family could only sit and wait, their hearts pounding, as if the universe itself had paused before revealing the next step in his journey. The oceans and the silence, the telegram lay on the table like a silent messenger of fate. When the lights returned, the whole family gathered close, eyes fixed on Sundar as he lifted the paper once more. The words were brief, but heavy with promise. He had been accepted into Stanford University. The room fell into stunned silence. His father, usually calm and measured, sat down heavily as if the weight of pride and worry pressed on his chest at the same time. His mother clasped her hands together, tears welling in her eyes. She did not fully understand what Stanford meant, but she understood that it was far away, far beyond the familiar streets of Chennai, and that her son's journey was about to change forever. The excitement of the moment quickly gave way to a harsh reality. How would they afford it? The cost of traveling across the oceans, the tuition, the living expenses, it was more than the family had ever imagined. Sundar's father sold what little savings they had, even borrowing money from friends, swallowing his pride because he believed in his son. His mother prayed every night, whispering words to the gods, asking them to protect the boy who was about to leave her side. When the day of departure came, Sundar stood at the airport holding his father's worn suitcase. It was not new, not modern, but it carried the hopes of an entire family. His mother pressed a packet of homemade snacks into his hand and touched his forehead with trembling fingers. "Never forget kindness," she whispered, her voice breaking. His father placed a hand on his shoulder. "Be humble no matter where you go. The world respects those who respect others." Sundar nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat, and then walked toward the gate, his heart pounding with fear and anticipation. The first sight of America was overwhelming. Tall buildings stretched into the sky, cars moved like rivers of steel, and everything seemed louder, faster, brighter than anything he had ever known. At Stanford, the campus looked like something from another world. Endless libraries, vast lawns, classrooms filled with students from every corner of the globe. Sundar felt small, invisible, like a leaf carried by a storm. The loneliness struck him harder than he had expected. At night, In his tiny room, he would sit by the window staring at the unfamiliar stars, missing the warmth of his mother's cooking, the quiet nods of his father, the laughter of his brother. He spoke little in class at first, afraid his accent would betray him, afraid he would not be understood. Sometimes he sat in the library, books spread out before him, but his mind wandered to the streets of Chennai, to the broken radio, to the simple joys of home. Yet amid the silence, he discovered resilience. When he struggled with assignments, he worked twice as hard. When he felt out of place, he reminded himself of his father's words. He observed his classmates carefully, not with envy, but with curiosity. He noticed how some of them rushed to answer every question, while others asked without fear of being wrong. Slowly, Sundar began to open his mouth, his voice steady, his answers precise. To his surprise, professors noticed. Students began to respect his quiet clarity, but life had its cruel tests. There were weeks when money ran out, when he had to choose between buying books or eating proper meals. There were days when he walked for hours to avoid paying for transport. There were nights when the homesickness was so heavy that he nearly packed his bag to return. Yet in those darkest hours, small acts of kindness became lifelines. A professor who lent him an old textbook, a fellow student who shared notes without being asked, a stranger who smiled at him on the bus when he looked lost. Each moment reminded him that the world, though vast and intimidating, could also be gentle. One afternoon, after months of struggle, Sundar received an invitation to his first job interview. It was with a small company, nothing prestigious, but to him it was a chance to prove that he could stand on his own feet in this new world. He ironed his only formal shirt carefully, polished his shoes until they shone, and practiced answers in front of the mirror. As he prepared to leave, the phone in his room rang. He picked it up, expecting a friend, but the voice on the other side was shaky, heavy with grief. It was his brother, calling from India. "Anna," he said, his words breaking. "There has been an accident. Father is not well." The room spun. Sundar gripped the edge of the table, his heart pounding so loud he could barely hear the rest of the words. The suitcase by his bed seemed to call out to him, the ocean between him and home suddenly wider than ever before. He stood frozen, caught between two worlds, the interview that could open doors to his future, and the family that had sacrificed everything to send him across the sea. The clock ticked loudly, each second a reminder that he could not wait forever. The choice loomed over him like a storm, and he knew that whatever decision he made would shape not only his path, but the trust his family had placed in him. And as he stood there, torn between duty and destiny, the phone slipped from his trembling hands, crashing onto the floor, the dial tone echoing like a haunting reminder that some moments in life demanded more than answers. They demanded the courage to face the silence. The battles of the mind. The phone call from India had shaken Sundar to his core, but life moved in waves and he learned to ride them even when they threatened to pull him under. His father's health slowly recovered, though the fear of losing him left an invisible scar. Sundar carried that scar with him into every lecture, every project, every sleepless night of study. He worked harder than ever, pushing through exhaustion because he knew now with absolute certainty that every second mattered, every opportunity was sacred. Years passed, and Sundar's quiet persistence became his shield. He finished his studies, took small jobs, and slowly built a reputation for being the man who would never give up, who would not raise his voice but would always deliver results. It was this reputation that carried him into Google, a company that at the time was already buzzing with restless energy, full of dreamers and warriors competing to shape the future of technology. The first day Sundar walked into the Google office, he felt a storm of excitement and fear. The walls were covered with whiteboards filled with equations and ideas scribbled in every direction. People rushed through the halls, debating, arguing, laughing. The air itself seemed to vibrate with invention. But beneath the energy, Sundar also sensed something else, competition so fierce it could cut through steel. Everyone wanted to be heard. Everyone wanted their vision to dominate. Sundar, true to his nature, did not rush to speak. He listened. He observed. He absorbed the culture of the place. He noticed that some people rose by speaking louder while others fell silent and were forgotten. He knew he could not play the game of noise. Instead, he chose patience, building respect one step at a time through his work. It was during this time that he conceived an idea. A new browser, faster, simpler, built not for machines but for people. He called it Chrome. Yet when he first shared the concept with others, the response was far from encouraging. "We already have browsers," one senior engineer told him dismissively. "Why waste time building another? Microsoft dominates this space. We should focus on other battles." Others laughed, calling it impossible, a distraction, even foolish. The rejection stung, but Sundar did not argue. He had learned long ago that arguments often ended in walls, not bridges. Instead, he returned to his desk, quietly refining his vision. He gathered a small team of believers, people who, like him, saw not just what existed but what could be. Together they worked long nights hidden away in quiet rooms, building something the world had not yet imagined it needed. But the resistance did not fade. At meetings, powerful voices ridiculed the project. Some said it would never launch, others said it would launch and fail, embarrassing the company. Sundar sat through the criticism with calm eyes, never raising his tone, never snapping back. Yet inside, he carried a storm of doubt. Was he wrong? Was he wasting his time? Was he risking his career, his family's sacrifices, on a dream too, fragile to survive? At home, the weight grew heavier. He remembered his mother's voice telling him to never forget kindness, his father's words about humility. He remembered the nights under the flickering streetlight, the broken radio, the telegram, the oceans he had crossed. Every memory reminded him that his life was not built on certainty, but on resilience. And so he pressed on, choosing work over sleep, clarity over despair. The day came when Sundar finally presented Chrome to the leadership team. The room was crowded, full of skeptical faces. Sundar stood at the front, his palms sweating, his voice steady but quiet. He spoke not with the fire of a salesman, but with the honesty of someone who believed deeply in what he was saying. "This is not just another browser," he explained. "This is a foundation for the future. It is about speed, simplicity, and trust. It is about giving users control." For a moment, the room was silent. Then the questions began. Harsh, sharp, meant to break his confidence. Sundar answered each one carefully, patiently, never rushing, never raising his voice. And slowly, something shifted. Not all, but a few began to listen. A few began to see what he saw. It was not victory, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall. But just as the dream began to breathe, life threw another twist. One evening, as Sundar sat alone at his desk, his phone buzzed. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was not. It was an executive from Microsoft speaking with a tone both friendly and sharp. They had been watching him, they said. They admired his work. They wanted him to join them, not just as another employee, but with a golden opportunity that promised power, prestige, and resources far greater than what he had at Google. Sundar froze. The words echoed in his ears. Microsoft was one of the giants, the very company people said he could never compete with. And now they were calling him, offering him a place among them. The weight of the decision pressed down like iron. Stay loyal to the company that doubted him, or cross over to a rival that promised him everything. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the offer repeating in his mind like a haunting song. In the quiet of the night, with only the hum of the office machines around him, Sundar realized he was standing at a crossroads that could define not just his career, but his identity. And as the voice on the phone waited for his answer, Sundar's silence filled the room like thunder, leaving only one question burning in the air. Would he betray the path he had built? Or would he risk losing everything for a dream no one yet believed in? The crown of humility, the call from Microsoft, lingered in Sundar's ears long after the line went silent. He sat alone in the dimly lit office, the glow of his computer screen reflecting on his tired face. Outside the glass windows, the city pulsed with life, but inside Sundar felt as though he were suspended in a quiet storm. The offer was everything any ambitious technologist could dream of: power, resources, respect, and a chance to shape the world from the heart of one of the biggest companies on the planet. Yet the thought of leaving Google, the place where he had struggled, been doubted, and quietly carved his path, weighed on him like a stone he could not drop. That night, when he returned home, the walls of his apartment seemed too small to contain his thoughts. His wife noticed the heaviness in his step, the silence in his eyes. She waited until he had placed his bag on the chair and sat down before asking gently, "Something is troubling you." Sundar hesitated, then told her everything. The struggles at Google, the skepticism around Chrome, the unexpected call from Microsoft. As he spoke, his voice was calm, but his heart raced with every word. She listened patiently, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she did not immediately advise or judge. Instead, she reached for his hand and said softly, "What do you want truly? Not what looks brighter, not what others will praise, but what makes you feel at peace when you close your eyes." Sundar leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. All he could see was the flickering streetlight of his childhood, the broken radio, his mother's whisper about kindness, his father's voice about humility. Sleep did not come easily in those days. Sundar would lie awake staring at the ceiling, thoughts running in endless circles. On one side, the promise of Microsoft glimmered like a golden crown. On the other, the path at Google stretched out like a road full of thorns, uncertain and harsh. He remembered the laughter of colleagues who said Chrome was a waste. He remembered the frustration of leaders who told him to abandon the project. Staying at Google meant more battles, more nights of doubt. Leaving meant giving up the dream he had fought to defend. One evening, unable to carry the weight alone, Sundar called his mother in India. The line crackled with distance, but her voice came through warm and steady. After listening to his dilemma, she said, "My son, do not chase crowns. Crowns are heavy and they fall. Chase truth, because truth stays with you forever. If your heart tells you to build something for people, then stay with that. Even if the world does not clap, God will know." Sundar held the phone tightly, tears burning his eyes. It was not advice about companies or money. It was advice about life. The days stretched into weeks, and the pressure grew. Whispers in the office reached him. People knew Microsoft was after him. Some encouraged him to go, saying it was the smart choice. Others looked at him with suspicion, wondering if his heart was already elsewhere. Sundar stayed quiet, carrying his conflict like a secret fire. In meetings, he presented calmly, but inside he felt as though he were walking a thin rope above a storm. Then came the night before the announcement ceremony, where Google would reveal new projects to the world. Chrome was scheduled to be presented, and Sundar was at the center of it. He could barely sit still, pacing the length of his apartment, torn between choices that both seemed impossible. His wife watched him, her voice firm but loving. "You already know your answer," she said. "You are just afraid to trust it." Sundar stopped, staring at her, realizing she was right. The morning of the ceremony arrived, and the air in the auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Journalists filled the seats, cameras clicked, lights shone bright. Executives whispered behind the stage, some doubting, some curious. Sundar stood backstage, his heart thudding in his chest. He thought of his father's tired smile, his mother's trembling hands, the telegram that had once carried him across oceans. He thought of the small boy in Chennai who had dared to touch a broken radio, believing he could bring it back to life. As he stepped onto the stage, the room fell quiet. The spotlight burned on him and the crowd leaned forward. He began to speak, his voice soft but steady, painting a picture of Chrome not as a product, but as a vision for the future. He spoke of simplicity, speed, and trust, not in technical jargon but in words that ordinary people could feel. He was no longer the quiet boy mocked in school. He was a man carrying the weight of dreams, not just his own but of millions waiting for a better way to connect with the world. The presentation ended, and for a moment there was silence. Then the applause came. hesitant at first, then stronger, then thunderous. Sundar bowed his head slightly, humility softening the moment even as his heart raced. But just as the applause reached its peak, something unexpected happened. An executive stepped onto the stage, leaning toward the microphone. His voice was calm but carried a tone of finality. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before we move forward, there is one more announcement, something that may surprise you all." The audience hushed, waiting. Sundar stood frozen, his mind flashing with fear. Was this about him? Had news of Microsoft's offer leaked? Had a decision already been made without him? The executive smiled faintly, pausing long enough for tension to ripple across the room. And then he spoke words that made Sundar's blood run cold. "There has been a change in leadership, and tonight we welcome a new name to the spotlight. Someone who will play a role larger than anyone here expected." The crowd gasped. Sundar's breath caught in his throat. He stood under the blazing lights, uncertain if the name about to be spoken was his, or if fate was about to turn away from him forever. The medal to his mother. The air in the grand hall was heavy with expectation. Chandeliers cast a golden glow over the polished wooden floor, and rows of seats stretched out, filled with ministers, dignitaries, journalists, and curious citizens who had been waiting for this moment. Outside, the streets were lined with people, waving flags, chanting with pride. The day was historic not just for India, but for millions across the world who had followed Sundar Pichai's journey from the narrow lanes of Chennai to the helm of one of the most powerful companies on earth. Sundar stood quietly near the stage, his posture humble, his face calm, but his heart carried the weight of countless memories. He thought of his childhood under the flickering streetlight, of the broken radio that had first whispered a dream into his ears, of the telegram that had carried him across oceans. He thought of the battles inside Google, the doubts, the sleepless nights, the moment he had chosen resilience over temptation, and most of all, he thought of his family. His father's sacrifices, his brother's laughter, and his mother's gentle hands that had steadied him every time he faltered. When his name was called, the applause was thunderous. Sundar walked onto the stage, each step slow, measured, as though he were carrying not just himself but the hopes of every child who had ever wondered if dreams could rise from small places. Modi ji stood at the center, smiling, his eyes sharp with recognition of the moment's gravity. As the applause slowly faded, Modi ji raised his hand, signaling silence. He began to speak, his voice calm yet filled with weight. "Today we celebrate a son of India, a boy who grew up with little but who carried inside him the fire of resilience and the grace of humility. The world calls him a genius, but genius is never born in isolation. It is shaped by the values of family, by the kindness of mothers, by the sacrifices of fathers. Sundar Pichai is proof that respect and humility can build bridges that ambition alone cannot." Sundar lowered his head, humbled, his throat tight with emotion. He expected the medal to be placed around his neck, the applause to rise again, the cameras to flash. But Modi ji's next words struck like lightning through the hall. "We call Sundar a genius," he said, his voice firm. "But tonight, the medal belongs not to him, but to the woman who raised him. For behind every man who rises there is a mother who lifted him first. Today we honor her." The hall erupted in gasps. Sundar's eyes widened and he turned instinctively toward the front row, where his mother sat quietly in her simple sari, her hands folded, her eyes shining with tears she had been holding back all evening. For a moment, she looked uncertain, almost shrinking into her seat, as though she did not belong in such a grand hall. But Modi ji gestured for her to rise, and the audience parted with respect as she walked toward the stage, her steps slow, her hands trembling, her heart pounding, louder than the applause. Sundar could not hold back his tears. He bowed his head as his mother reached the stage, the very stage where he had expected to stand alone. Modi ji placed the medal gently in her hands, and the moment froze in time. A symbol larger than titles, larger than companies, larger even than success itself. His mother's voice was soft but carried across the hall when she finally spoke. "I do not understand machines," she said, her eyes glistening. "I do not understand the world my son has built, But I understand love. I understand kindness. And I taught him those things because that is all I had. If he is respected today, it is not because of me, but because he remembered kindness when he could have chosen pride. The hall rose in a standing ovation, not for a CEO, not for a world figure, but for a mother who had given the world a lesson in humility. Sundar stood, beside her, his hand gently holding hers, his head bowed deeper than it had ever bowed before. He did not feel diminished by the gesture. He felt lifted. For in that moment he realized that true greatness was not measured by titles or medals, but by the ability to remain humble enough to honor those who had shaped you. Later that night, as the celebrations quieted and the hall emptied, Sundar sat alone with his mother. The medal lay between them on the table, shining softly in the dim light. He touched it gently and said, "Amma, this is yours." She shook her head and replied, "No, it is ours. You carried me when I was tired, and I carried you when you were small. We walked this journey together." The words sank deep into Sundar's heart. He realized then that every choice he had made, staying at Google when others doubted him, choosing resilience over glory, speaking softly when others shouted, had been guided not by ambition alone, but by the values she had planted in him long ago. As the night stretched on, Sundar walked to the balcony, looking out at the city lights below. He thought of the children in narrow streets, studying under flickering lamps, wondering if the world could ever hear their voices. He thought of his journey, and he understood now more than ever that his story was not about rising alone, but about showing others that respect, humility, resilience, and kindness could carry them too. He whispered into the night, almost to himself, "The real medal is not gold. The real medal is the life we live, the way we carry others as we climb." Behind him, his mother called softly, "Come inside, Sundar. It is late." He turned, smiling through his tears, and stepped back into the room where the medal lay, not as a crown on his own head, but as a shining reminder of a truth that would outlive him. And so the story of Sundar Pichai did not end with applause or with titles, but with a quiet moment between a son and his mother, reminding the world that true greatness is never about one person alone. It is about the light we pass on, the humility we carry, and the kindness that remains long after the applause fades.